Hello everyone, and welcome to a very nice game from round 9 of the 2018 Batumi Chess Olympiad. It's a game from the top boards. Poland is playing against the United States, and on board 1 we have young Krzysztof Duda versus World Chess Championship challenger Fabiano Caruana. Now, it's very interesting. I couldn't watch the entire coverage as I was in Zagreb today, but I did post a tweet about what are your predictions about this Duda versus Caruana matchup. So as you can see, 43 people voted that Caruana wins 70%, 21% that it will be a draw, and only 9% that Duda would actually win this game. So very nice. And if you look at Duda's last couple of opponents, for example, he won a very nice game against Vasily Ivanchuk, a brilliancy you might say. Then after that he drew a game against Shahriar Mamedyarov, and then in the previous game he drew a game against Levon Aronyan with a brilliant rook sacrifice. So beating Vasily Ivanchuk and then facing a 2800 player and then almost 2800 player, and now facing the World Chess Championship challenger, definitely not an easy tournament for a young Polish grandmaster. So without further ado, let's see how this game went. We have c4 by Duda, the English opening, e5, knight to c3, and the knight to f6. And I'm warning you, this game is not for the faint of heart, as it's very intense. Knight to f3, knight to c6, the four knights variation of the English. We have e3 and the bishop to b4. Queen to c2, bishop captures on c3, queen captures on c3, and now queen to e7, perhaps with ideas of pushing e4, so d4 immediately. We have knight to e4 with an attack on the queen, queen to d3, and now e captures on d4. Knight captures on d4, and here Caruana castles. We have bishop to e2, and now queen to b4 with check. And here, while you could block check, it's best to play king to f1. This is a well-known line that was played plenty of times by many strong grandmasters. King to f1, and now comes queen back to e7. f3, kicking away the knight. We have knight to c5, attacking the queen. The king will be ready to perhaps castle artificially with king to f2, and the rook may come into the game. And this is a position that was already on the board this year. It was played in the Singfield Cup between Wesley So and Sergei Karyakin. Here in this position, Wesley So continued with queen to d2, and that game was a draw. For this game, Duda prepared queen to c3. So this is a new move, and now we have a completely new game that is not available in the database. And okay, d6, Caruana prepares to develop the light square bishop. We have knight captures on c6, b captures on c6, and now b3. So white is definitely okay here. He still has the bishop pair, and black's pawn structure is somewhat weakened, but it's not that big of a deal. Here b3 was played. You could consider a move like b4 with ideas of pushing a4 and going for some rapid pawn pushing on the queen side, but after knight a4, attacking the queen, queen to c2, the knight will come to b6, and now it's not all that clear if this is actually good for white. So instead, Duda goes for b3, a slower idea, preparing bishop to b2. We have a5, and now comes bishop to b2. So already you can see that Duda is threatening checkmate on g7. Fabi stops this with f5. The queen is now preventing checkmate, and also f5 is nicely covering the e4 square, preventing white from any e4 ideas himself. Not at the moment, of course, when the king is on f1, but in the future. Here you could go king to f2, castle artificially, and so on, but first Duda decides to go rook to d1. And okay, bishop to e6, Caruana also develops his pieces, and only now king to f2. And here, as the rook moved from a1, this allows Caruana to get rid of his isolated pawn on the a file. He pushes a4. b4 is played, and now comes knight to d7. Caruana played knight to d7, spending only a few seconds on the clock. But also possible is actually a3. But a3 is a wild engine move that perhaps was also looked at home by Caruana. But it's a very nice line that shows how engines really simplify everything. Because now after bishop captures, you can simply go knight to a4, attack the queen, after queen to c2, now you push c5. And now after b captures on c5, knight captures on c5, and here, even though white can play bishop captures, pawn captures, so you do have double c-pawns, this rook is coming to a6, the other rook is coming to a8, and with the doubled rooks on the a file, black has full compensation for this pawn, and white will most likely not be able to hold his own extra pawn. So a very nice idea. But okay, after b4, knight to d7, rook to d2, and now comes f4. Rook to c1. If you play something like e4, it seems like the most appropriate thing to do. Then rook to f6 with ideas of rook to g6 or h6 would be very annoying for white. So after f4, we have rook to c1, and now comes rook a to d8. Rook comes to d4, and now f captures on e3. Queen captures on e3, and only now c5. B captures on c5, knight captures on c5, and now comes king to g1, bringing his king to safety and getting it away from the f-file. Queen to f7, now threatening all sorts of discoveries with the bishop. Queen to f2, moving the queen away, and now comes bishop to f5. And okay, bishop back to f1, we have rook to e7, and now bishop to a3. An interesting move is perhaps remaneuvering this bishop to a more useful square via bishop to e4, as you can't capture the bishop due to queen captures on f2, but after something like rook to d2, the bishop will remaneuver itself to a different diagonal, but Caruana decides against this. So we have rook to e5, and now comes queen to d2. Doubling on the d file. Rook f to e8, now Caruana doubles rooks on the e file, and now comes rook to d5, offering a trade of rooks. And now h6. If you exchange here, for example, rook captures, then pawn captures will be very strong, as now black will constantly have to keep an eye on his weak backwards c7 pawn, and also the a4 pawn will not be all that impressive. So instead, after rook to d5, h6, Caruana doesn't mind if the exchange happens on e5. So first, the bishop captures on c5, d captures on c5, and now we have queen to a5, saying to Fabiano that your pawns on the queen side are somewhat weak. But Caruana ignores him. He simply plays queen to e7. And now it is possible to capture a pawn. For example, if queen captures on a4, you get rook captures on d5. And after pawn captures, queen to e3 check. But you don't want to allow this queen to e3 check. It looks very annoying. King to h1, and while you can't capture on c1 right away because queen would capture on e8, you can play something like bishop to d3, and now things have gone crazy here. You would really have to figure out what to do here, but if you're really not sure, and you have to reach time control, perhaps you don't want to waste too much time. Of course, you cannot capture because now this capturing on c1 will lead to checkmate after white gives up all of his pieces. But yeah, after rook to e7, Duda decides against this. He plays rook d to d1, controlling the e1 square. And now we have queen to g5. Again, Fabio offers the a4 pawn, but Duda again decides against it. First, king to h1, not allowing this queen to e3 to ever come with check. We have queen to e3 now, and here comes queen captures on c7. Queen to f2, and now comes queen to a5. You do have to keep an eye on the e1 square, and now queen captures on a2 by Caruana. Rook to a1, attacking the queen, queen to b3, and now comes h3, making some additional squares for the king if things get crowded on the first rank. King to h7, and now comes rook to d5. If you play something like rook captures, then you get pawn captures, and yes, black does get a nice passed pawn here, but white also gets a very nice passed pawn here, so not something you want to do. So after rook to d5, bishop to c2 is played. And now we have queen to d2, a very nice move, and here you don't really want to allow something like a3 and then this bishop to d3 to come with check. If you allow this check, then you get the bishop captures, rook captures with an attack on the queen, and after the queen moves, you can simply capture this pawn. Rook a captures on a3, and you've just lost a very nice pawn. So after queen to d2, Fabi goes back with the bishop to g6, And here, this is move 40, so time control has been reached by both players. And it's very interesting, on Duda's next move, he spends 20 minutes. Although it's a move that seems to have cost him the game, it's actually not at all easy to find a useful move here for white. Here, the engine's recommendation, as it is a very wild position, is actually king to h2 to allow rook captures on d5, and after c captures on d5, a3. And now, after queen to a5, going after the 2 pawns, now queen captures on d5. Queen captures on a3, and now after c4, queen to c3, you have to blockade the passed pawn, and after bishop to d3, bishop captures, c captures, and now rook to d1, and with the material being equal on the board, white will be able to prevent this d pawn from moving forward. You will not really be able to improve the pressure with black, because if you try and get the king over, then you will simply expose him to too much danger. So while this is definitely the way to go for white, it's pretty much impossible to find something like this, as Duda did spend 20 minutes on his next move. So here he played queen to a5, and Caruana really punished this excellently. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find the move Caruana played. I'll give you a couple of seconds as usual, but you know, you take as much time as you need, as it's not a very easy move to find. For those of you who were able to do it, congratulations, you are an excellent punisher of not so obvious inaccuracies. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, the move Caruana played was queen to b4. And queen to b4, it's excellent for many reasons. One such reason is that if you capture the queen, for example, queen captures, you get c captures now with 2 pawns. And now after rook captures on a4, rook captures here, and now after pawn captures on d5, you get rook to e1. And there's no way to protect the bishop, because after king g1, you get bishop to d3, and black is winning here. On the other hand, after this queen to b4 move, if you just move the queen, let's say you play rook to c7, queen to c7, then you get rook to e1. And again, a very annoying move that comes with a similar idea. And now after rook captures, and king g1, you don't have bishop d3, because the rook is guarding d3 as well. But queen captures on c4, the bishop is pinned, and black wins this. So, after queen to b4, a rook captures on a4 was played by Duda, but it leads to a very similar outcome. Queen captures on a5, rook captures on a5, and now rook captures on d5. We have pawn captures here, and now comes rook to e1, so a pretty similar idea. King to g1, and now bishop to d3. There's no way to prevent losing the bishop, but now comes rook captures on c5. Rook captures on f1 with check, king to h2, and now comes rook to d1. And here we have a very interesting position where Duda has 2 pawns for the bishop, and you might think that, okay, this is now completely resignable. I'm just going to resign this, shake Caruana's hand for playing such a wonderful game. I made one silly inaccuracy, he took advantage of it, it's all over. But not quite. Duda continues this game. He plays king to g3. And okay, here we have bishop to f1 by Caruana. An improvement to this bishop to f1 would have been a move that is not all that obvious to find, but bishop to f1 comes with the idea that rook to d2 will attack the pawn. But even better is bishop to a6, forcing this rook to keep an eye on the d5 pawn, and now waiting for white to make a move. Pushing any pawns wouldn't really be all that impressive for white, and when white finally decides to make a move with the king, only now you get bishop to f1, and now you can't really protect the pawns here. If you protect it with the rook, then rook captures on d5. If you push the pawn, then you lose the h3 pawn. And if you go back with the king, then you've just gained the move. Rook d2 would now grab this pawn. Okay, it perhaps would be a small improvement. Bishop to f1 immediately by Caruana. We have king to f2, and now comes king to g6. h4. Bishop to d3, and here a very nice tactical shot by Duda, h5 with check. A very nice move, because now if you capture with the king, you get the d6, a discovered check. King to g6 and rook to d5, threatening d7 and d8 with queen. Here, black would have to go rook to f1 check, and after king to e3, now comes the bishop to f5. First, you have to move the rook, so rook captures on d1 will not be possible. But now d7, bishop captures, rook captures, and now a rook and 2 pawns each. This is a drawn endgame. So after h5, king to f5 was played, and now we have rook to c7, going after the pawns, and also preparing to push his own past d pawn. We have king back to f6, and now comes rook back to c6 with check. King g5, and now rook back to c7. Caruana tries g6. And okay, h captures on g6, we have bishop captures on g6, and now rook to d7. Rook to d2 check, we have king to g3, and now bishop back to d3, with ideas of playing bishop to f1. Rook to e7, we have bishop back to f5 now, attacking the d5 pawn, and now comes king to h2. We have h5, and now comes d6. Again, if you capture it immediately, rook captures on d6, then g4 is a very powerful move. After h captures, g captures, bishop captures, or king captures for that matter, doesn't really matter. You would get this rook and bishop against a rook endgame where white will be able to hold a draw. So after d6, h4 was played, and now comes rook to g7 check. King to f4, and now comes rook to g8. Rook captures on d6, grabbing the pawn, but now again Duda finds a very nice idea. g3, he's able to trade off all of the pawns. We have king captures on f3, and now comes pawn captures on h4. Rook to d2 with check, and now comes king to g1. And this appears to be the critical moment in the game, one of the critical moments, but no, this is the critical moment of the game, where Caruana actually has a series of winning moves here, but I don't think this is possible for a human to find. But feel free to pause the video here and give it your best. But by give it your best, don't even pause the video if you're not planning on spending at least, I don't know, 10 minutes on it. It's very, very complicated. So okay, for those of you who were able to do it, I congratulate you, as I struggled realizing how this was even possible while the engine was explaining it to me, as it's really not all that. And for those of you who just wanted to enjoy the show, okay, the engine's favorite is rook to d1, but this leads to the obvious move that will come later. So we're just gonna disregard this one and go for the main one. In the game, Caruana played bishop to g4, and he tried a similar idea, but it's actually bishop to e4 that wins the game here. This comes with a very difficult idea. Best just to show it. For example, now if rook to f8 check, you play king to e3. The rook doesn't allow the king to move the second rank. Of course, you don't want this. And the bishop is very useful. It covers the h1 square. So what you want is at some point for this king to be on f1, and you want to play king to rook to h2 to h1 checkmate, for example. So how to accomplish this? Okay, white will play something. Rook to f7. First, you have to get rid of the h4 pawn. For example, rook g2 check. Now you can't go to h1 to allow some discoveries. You have to go to f1, and now comes rook to h2. And okay, now all seems. Now you understand why bishop had to go to e4 to cover h1. So now you can't go king g1 because rook to h1 will be checkmate. The bishop and king are covering these two squares, so rook to h1 will be checkmate. So to avoid checkmate, you have to move the king so the rook can come save you, and now you lose the h-pawn. So okay, this is how you win the h-pawn while still keeping the king in the mating net. Now comes rook to f2. White has to play something. Still, you have to keep an eye on the f1 square. Rook h1 check, rook f1, rook to h2. White will simply move back. Still has to keep an eye on the f1 square. Now you go rook to a2, threatening rook to a1 checkmate. And okay, rook to d7. Now you have to waste a move with rook to b2. This is also a very important technique. Now, white still has to keep an eye on d1. You can't allow rook to b1 checkmate. So here, rook to d8. And now you play rook back to g2. And this is where the magic happens. Now you have to see that the bishop is also guarding c2. So you can't play a move like king to d1 because you would get rook to g1 checkmate. So your only options are rook to f8 that covers the f1 square, or king to f1. Unfortunately for white, king to f1 doesn't work because now you get rook to h2 with the threat of checkmate. Rook to g8 trying to prevent checkmate, but now you get rook to c2. Again, you're threatening rook to c1 checkmate. And now there's there's no saving white. You can't prevent with rook to d8 because rook to c1 would simply force you to give up the rook and win the game. On the other hand, the only move that prolongs checkmate is rook to g1. But now you get rook to c1 check, king to h2, rook to h1 check. Again, you see the importance of the bishop being on e4. King to g3, and now comes rook to g1 with check. King to h4, finally winning the rook. White is not able to stalemate this, and black will now win the game. So after this rook to g2 move, we see that the rook can't stay here. You can't play anything. Rook to f1 doesn't work, so you have to play rook to f8 to avoid checkmate with rook to f1. And now comes bishop to g6. Again, a very, very important move, covering the e8 square, not allowing any checks. And again, black has to decide what to do here. Still, you can play rook to d1 because the bishop is guarding the c2 square. So rook to g1 is the threat of checkmate. And rook has to keep an eye on the f1 square. So what do you do here? Rook to f6. And now you go all the way here, rook to b2. Again, you can either check, but then bishop to e4 will be winning. And if you capture the bishop, then of course rook to c1 will be checkmate. So you have to play something else, rook to d6. You have to prevent this rook to b1 by being able to play rook to d1. Now you get bishop to d3. And now there's really nothing to do here anymore. You have to play rook to e6 check. And now after bishop to e4, you have this position where now everything is set, and now it doesn't matter what white plays. After rook to d6, again threatening, preventing checkmate via rook to d1. Now you get rook to h2, but now it's a completely different story. Again, king to d1 doesn't work because of rook to h1. After rook to f6, blocking this check, now you get rook to e2 check. King to f1 or d1 doesn't really matter. Black will just go to the other way. Now you get rook to b2, and now you get the exact same position that was at the beginning of this entire maneuvering, only the king is already on f1. So this is white's problem now. Now there's nothing to do anymore. After king to g1, now rook to g2 is coming, and after king to f1, now comes rook to g5, a very important move. And now there are no more moves that save white. After king to e1, you get you will receive rook to g1. First you will receive bishop to d3, but then after you block here, now you will get rook to h5, and now there are no more options here. If instead of this rook to e6, you try to keep an eye on the f file and go rook to f8, then bishop to d3 check is coming. This will also be very unpleasant. After king to e1, then comes rook to g1, rook f1, and rook captures. So that's not possible. So that's why rook to e6, and now we get rook to h5, threatening rook to h1, and now you cannot prevent anything because the king is already on f1. So nothing to do here, king g1, rook h1, so here you would simply have to capture the bishop, and then now king captures. And now a king and rook will win against the king. So definitely not an easy move to find. Bishop to e4, Caruana in the game played bishop to g4, but now the winning, any series of moves is no longer winning for Caruana. But as his team is losing, Hikaru Nakamura lost on board 3, he has to keep torturing young Duda and perhaps grab something more than a draw here. Rook to f8 check, king moves, and now comes h5. You have to give up this pawn as it's pretty much irrelevant. We have bishop captures on h5, and now rook to g8 check. Bishop moves, and now rook to f8, keeping an eye on this f1 square, not allowing the king to go anywhere. So here we have rook to d6. Caruana will try a lot of things, but nothing works, unfortunately, for him. Rook to f2, rook to d1 check, king to f1, rook to f1, and then, oops, sorry about that. I mistakenly took it all the way back. So here we were. Yeah, he gave up the pawn, bishop captures, rook g8, we have bishop to g4, and now rook to f8 covering the f1 square. Rook to d6, and now rook to f2. Simply controlling the f file, rook to d1, rook blocks, rook to d2, rook to f8, and now rook to e2. Just waiting for a blunder from Duda. Rook to f7, rook to e1, and now rook blocks with rook to f1. Rook to e2, we have rook back to f8, and now bishop to e6. And okay, rook to f6, we have bishop to h3, and now comes again rook to g6 with check, forcing the king back. Bishop blocks, and now rook back to f6, simply controlling the f1 square. Rook to g2 check, king moves, and now rook to h2, threatening rook to h1, as now the bishop is also very conveniently covering the e2 square, but now comes king back to g1. Rook e2, we have rook back to f8, again keeping an eye on the f1 square, and now rook to e5. Rook to f2, we have bishop to f3, but now again a very nice move that saves white. It's a rook to g2 with check. Now, of course, capturing doesn't really do anything as it's stalemate. The white king has no legal moves. So after rook to g2, Caruana goes back, king f4. We have rook to a2, rook to e1 check, king moves, and now rook to h1, threatening to grab the rook via rook to h2, but rook to a7. And there's simply nothing Caruana can do to improve his position here. Check, king f1, bishop to e4, we have rook to a3, rook to b2, rook to g1, king to g1, bishop to f3, rook to a7, and here the position was repeated a couple of more times. Bishop g4, rook to f7, rook b8, rook to f2, bishop to f3, again rook to g2, second time going for this idea, king to f4, rook goes back, bishop to e4, and now rook to a3, cutting the king off. If the king is cut off, no checkmate is possible. Rook b2, rook to h3, rook g2 check, king moves, bishop to f3, now comes rook to h8, you have to keep on checking the black king, rook to a2, and now rook to b8. King tries to cut off the king, but now rook to g8 check, bishop blocks, and now rook to e8. Again, the idea is the same, you have to keep control of d1 square, not allow checkmate. Rook to a1 check, rook to e1, rook to a5, rook to e8, rook to d5. Caruana really did everything he could to save his team, but it just wasn't possible. Rook to e7, rook d8, rook to e3 with check, bishop blocks, now comes rook e7, king f4, king to f2, rook d2 check, king moves to e1, rook to h2, and now rook to a7. Rook to e2 check, king to f1, rook to d2, rook to c7, king to g3, rook g7 with check, bishop g4, rook to e7, rook to f2 with check, king g1, rook d2, king to f1, rook e2, rook captures on e2. Finally, Caruana offers the rook and the draw, and after bishop captures, the draw was agreed upon. Although, you know, if I was in their shoes, I would probably even capture the bishop just, you know, to have a clear board. They played for so long. The game lasted for 118 moves, and finally the game ended in a draw. So this is something I wanted to show you before I forget. These are all of Duda's opponents. So as you can see, he had a kind of a rough start to the tournament, losing a game in round 2 against Grandmaster Luis Galego from Portugal and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from France in round 4. But then, like we said, he defeated Vasily Ivanchuk and then drew against Mamedyarov, then drew against Levon Aronen with the wonderful rook sacrifice, and then again drew against Fabiano Caruana. And it's very interesting if you look at his live rating performance up there. He's actually down for rating points with this performance. So you beat Ivanchuk and then you draw 3 games in a row against Aronen, Mamedyarov, and Caruana, and you are down in ratings. That's just how brutal chess is at the top. Also, these are the performances on the board. As you can see, Duda drew against Caruana, Wojtaszek drew against Wesley So, Piorun, as we've said, won his game against Nakamura. This is the game that allowed Poland to beat United States, and Tomczak drew his game against Sam Shankland. And before I forget, here these are the standings after round 9. So in a clear first place is Poland, with 2 more rounds to go in the Olympiad. Then we have United States, Armenia, China, England, France, Russia, Croatia in 8th, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, Vietnam, Israel, Azerbaijan, India, Czech Republic, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Serbia, and Norway in 20th place. So there you have it, and this is the strongest Polish team since the 1930s. In the 3rd Chess Olympiad that was ever played in 1930, Poland won the Olympiad, but they were led by Rubinstein and Tartakover, so it took a lot for Poland to get back to the top, but it seems that with young Krzysztof Duda leading Poland, that they seem to have a very bright future. So that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. I doubt anyone ever actually watched this game to the end, but that bishop to e4 move is simply mind-blowing. I don't think... I mean, perhaps if you really study it, but Caruana did spend a lot of time on this move, so if he didn't find it, I don't know. Seems like a very tough decision to make over the board. I would like to thank Alexandru Epuran, Kenneth Schellberg, Danny McCullough, David Rossi, and Rolf Enger for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you soon, hopefully with another interesting game, and hope if I'll have the time, I'm planning to continue the Bobby Fischer series as soon as possible. So thank you all, and I'll see you soon.